I don't know about you, but I did not get into the restaurant business to spend all my time in a cramped little office. I love being in the kitchen, out on the floor. And if you're nodding your head right now, I want to introduce you to an amazing company called Starfish. Look, I've gotten to know their CEO, Jordan, recently, and what they're building really impresses me. They're using AI to read your P&L, and they're going to email you actionable insights every week so you can lower your costs and increase revenue. Best part is you don't have to spend time digging through your P&Ls, poring over reports in that cramped little office. Starfish is going to do that for you so you can get back to the part of the business that you love. If you're interested, go to their website, use starfish.com. That's USE starfish.com. And tell them Simon sent you. You're listening to the Culinary Mechanic Podcast. I'm your host, Simon Zatyrka, the founder of Culinary Mechanic, a restaurant advisory firm focused on making kitchens and restaurants run like well-oiled machines. With this podcast, we aim to bring you insights, strategies, tools, and tactics, and sometimes just good old advice and stories that are going to help you run your restaurant better. I hope you dig it because honestly, it's a real labor of love. One thing you could do that would help me a whole lot is to go anywhere that you listen to podcasts and leave a 5-star review. That'll help get the word out so that more people will hear this podcast and hopefully we can help more restaurants run just a little better. Now please, enjoy the show. Welcome to Culinary Mechanic. I'm your host, Simon Zatyrka. So normally at this moment I would say, okay, here's our new guest and all the things and the stuff, right? But I've decided that it's time to do a little bit of solo stuff, solo things. And I think that we're going to talk a little bit today about just, well, I've got two things written down in front of me. And they're things that I've said for years to other people, but also to myself. Number one is the industry is tough. The work is hard. If you're not having fun, you need to get out. Seems pretty simple. And the second is being a great cook is not enough to be a great chef. And so with that, I think that it's really important to acknowledge at this point that this is episode 40. And we've come a long way. I've come a long way with this whole thing. I was looking back over some previous episodes and looked at the Simon's Journey, Volume 1, 2, and 3. I even watched a little bit of Volume 3, and I feel like I've gotten a whole lot better at this since then, and that was probably 8 or 9 months ago. I definitely have changed the vision of what I began with when I started this whole expedition back in December of 2023. It was called Chef Journeys, and that was really important to me, and I don't think we've lost any of the journey aspect of it, but we've definitely opened things up a little bit so that it's not just chefs. We've brought some cool tech guys on. We've brought in different consultants and folks who are doing things that are similar to what I do, but also perhaps a little bit different at the same time. Our last episode was Kristen Marvin, and that was our first repeat episode, and that was amazing because she's just, I said it before, she's just a force of nature. And so I wanted to kind of, do a little bit of wrap up around where, what caused me to leave restaurant operations, because back in the beginning of 2022, things had just shifted. I had a new boss all of a sudden, and it wasn't, honestly, it wasn't great. Largely just different. I don't know that person was a bad person. I still don't think he is. But I felt like my vision of my future, my vision of my present, and things were not aligning with what the company was looking for at that point in time, and that's okay. But I think more than all of that, that first statement that I said here was, if you're not having fun, you need to get out, and the fun had drifted away. So at the urging of my wife, and after some serious soul searching, I decided that I would step away. And so, April 24th, 2022, that's my quit-iversary, by the way. That was a day where that was my last day of work with my last company. And I decided, though maybe it wasn't all my decision, but I decided to take some time. And initially it was a couple weeks, and then it was a month, and then it was 2 months. I think after really getting the opportunity to slow down and stop and not be grinding away all day, and given the opportunity to just stop and think about who I am and what I want to be when I grow up, or grow up again, or what I want to be right now. And what the next stage was, I found that, gosh, I think I got about a month in, and I looked at my wife and I said, if I figure out a plan, what do you think about me taking 4 months off? And she said, do what you want to do. Do your thing. Very, 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 very supportive. So that was helpful. And so, I hired a career change coach. I did my due diligence, and I searched the interwebs, and I found myself a guy who was based out of Detroit. His name was Joe LeDuc. Shout out to Joe LeDuc, because that guy's amazing. And he and I just we dug deep into what my values were and are, and what was important to me, and what would success look like. And now, 2 years later, I know that that's fairly standard coaching stuff, but it was very new to me at the moment. And so I started to look around and go, And as I did all of that, it became very clear to me that I wanted to. I'd spent the last 33 years at that point learning and being sort of one thing. I was a good cook. I was a good chef. On some days, I was a great chef. In some spaces, I was a really good developer of people. And I think that all depended on the day for me personally. And so all of that was a pretty tightly bound skill set, and I knew that I wanted to use my brain differently, and I knew that I wanted to push myself in different ways, and I wanted to learn new things. And I'll say new things because I didn't know what they were. Now, a little bit of dip into the future is I've discovered that I love the act of branding. I like the concept of creating a personal brand, and I like some of the actions of creating that personal brand. I'm fascinated by marketing. I'm fascinated by the consumption of social media as a marketing tool, how all of that interplays. But I know that I was a consumer of social media in the form of Facebook and Instagram, tickety-tockety, whatever that thing, TikTok, whatever that is. I don't think I really had a good grasp of that concept until maybe 2021. And now I post at least one video per day on TikTok, and that's kind of cool to watch my growth or lack of growth, to be perfectly honest with you. I'm stuck in something called 200 jail. Look it up. It's a thing. And I expect that over time I'll learn enough little tricks to continue to get out of 200 jail. However, all of that said, I wanted to learn something. I wanted to stretch my brain. I wanted to use what I've got inside my brain to affect something different for myself. And so I'll be honest, in 2022, I had no idea what that was. In August of 2022, I'd had a few conversations with a friend, and she called me up and she says, Simon, would you like to do me a favor? And I said, I'd love to do you a favor. And she says, well, I've got this friend, and he's a consultant, and he needs somebody to cost a menu, and there's probably nobody better at costing menus than you. And I said, well, that might be a stretch, but okay, let's take a look. And so I got to meet this guy. His name is Jeff. And Jeff and I started, as he said, to to lay down tracks. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, well, he says, I'm a consultant, and you're potentially on the road to be a consultant. He says, I look at us as studio musicians. We're here to help. We're here to flesh out a sound. He says, I've always been the bass player. He says, I'm fairly certain, based on what I've heard about you, you're a lead guitarist. I think I actually might be the drummer. I'm not really sure, though. And I said, cool. And so we got to talking, and he introduced me to this restaurant group, and they had 4 restaurants. And they needed their restaurant. They needed their full menu costed. And at first I was like, you have 4 restaurants. You have a commissary that supplies a good amount of product for all 4 of those restaurants. Okay. So I went in, we started talking. They started showing me some of their spreadsheets and showing me how they'd been doing things. And here's where we're going to step aside into like a little bit of rabbit holeness, but that's okay. And I said, with all due respect, why am I here? You guys are jamming, busy. You got a lot of food in that commissary right behind us here. And it's going out in a very orderly fashion, and I don't see anybody scrambling. Why am I here? And the owner, he looks at me dead in the eye, and he says, well, here's the thing. It has always been on Wednesdays, I open up the book with my accountant, and if the number is bigger than it was last Wednesday, then I close the book. It's like, okay. And he says, but about 6 weeks ago, I started opening the book on Wednesdays, and the number wasn't growing. In fact, it was shrinking. I was like, wow, that's not great. And he says, yeah, so if that has continued to be the case, he says, I have to do something about it. I said, great. He says, but we don't really know where to begin. And so Jeff suggested that we, cost the menu and understand what it is we're putting into it and kind of figure out where the money's going. And I said, okay. And so, they were sending me recipes, and I'm not going to lie to you, some of those recipes were coming to me on Post-it notes. Some of them were on some scanned napkins. Interesting, by the way, just fun. Some of it came in the form of a Word document that they'd begun. But then there was a lot of, put 2 of those on there. Well, how much do those weigh? Oh, well, we don't know. 2 spoons of things. I'm like, what size spoon? And so I started asking questions, and I feel like at first I was like, oh, I'm asking too many questions. These guys are going to get mad. And they welcomed it and jumped into it and really got urgent on it. And so I think by the time that we had answered about 90 questions, they reached the point where they couldn't answer anymore because they didn't know the answers. And so they asked me to come into the commissary, and we went and did some troubleshooting, and I taught them how to find a couple of the yields that I was looking for so that we could really dial down into some of their batch pricing prices for some of their bigger products. And somewhere along the way, the guy, he kind of stops me and he says, you've really opened our eyes to a number of things that we could do better. Would you like to come help us with this? And I said, yeah, I think I would. And so just like that, overnight, I think I became an overnight consultant. Boom, accidental consultant. So I named it Culinary Mechanic because I needed an LLC, and that was real cool. Moved forward with them, worked on a number of projects and really got everything costed. One thing I noticed one day when I was in the restaurant, I was standing in the kitchen, kind of feeling my chefness as I looked around, and I looked at their steam table and I looked at their cold table, and I realized that all of their utensils that were used to get something to the plate were just kind of spoons, and they weren't a specific kind of spoon. Some were large, some were small. And so I started looking at the recipes going, well, what is a recipe that says 2 spoonfuls of rice? And so I asked one cook, and I said, can you do me a favor? She says, sure. I said, what is a spoon? Why don't you put 2 spoons of rice on like you would for that shawarma plate? And she did it. And then I asked the next cook, I said, why don't you come here? Will you put 2 spoons of rice on? And boom, it was different. And I looked at the owner and I said, so which one's right? And he said, somewhere in the middle. And I was like, oh, great. How do you know that? He goes, well, that's just what we do. And I said, okay. And so I started looking around. I asked, well, there's 4 restaurants. Are they all like this? He said, yeah. I said, well, how do you expect to create a consistent product and then a consistent cost from that product without any tools that measure things? And he says, oh, we've just always done it that way. Okay, great. So once again, accidental consultant, finding little things. We saved them more than 1.5 points on their food cost within, I don't know, I think it took 2 weeks. 2 weeks to get everybody settled. We threw away a bunch of spoons, or we hid them. I don't know. I think they got wrapped in plastic wrap, stuck in a corner somewhere. Somewhere along the way, I don't know, maybe a month, 2 months later, mid-October, I got a phone call. I got an email from somebody who I really trust. This is a guy who's been in restaurant accounting for what would you might call a millennia, probably 30 years, 40 years. And he said, and incidentally, we had worked together at my previous job at the company before. He says, Simon, I got a phone call yesterday from a guy who needs some help. He needs some help with costs and he needs some help with some POS stuff. He says, and I know you know how to do that. Would you be willing to talk to him for me, because I can't do it and my team is just too busy to be able to, have that kind of bandwidth. And besides that, we don't really do that kind of consulting anymore. I said, great. So talk to that guy, boom, 2 clients. Fast forward 2-3 months. Oh, by the way, that went real well. I was able to work with a cafe manager and get all the costing corrected and do some training with her and make sure that she knew how to kind of take over from there and make sure that was going to work for her as time went by. And then, here we go. We're into the fall and I'm working I'm not working hard. Working consistently with these 2 clients, and it's like the 2nd of January, and I get this weird text from a chef that I used to work with, and he says, "Hey, are you doing a consulting thing?" And I responded, "Yes, I am." And he says, "Would you do me a favor?" And I said, "I'd love to. What can I do?" And he says, "A lady that I used to work for owns a restaurant. It's a pizzeria. And she's having some issues with her chefs. And she'd like me to go in and sort of coach them on some leadership stuff." And I said, okay. How do he says, "I'm too busy. I've got no bandwidth for anything." He says, "My job is keeping me quite occupied." I said, "Totally get it." He says, "Would you go talk to her and just see if there's anything you can do?" He goes, "You always help me when we work together, and I genuinely appreciate it." So I said, great. So I went, and next thing I know, I'm having weekly conversations with a chef and a sous chef. And that was, I think, where I really started to understand where I wanted to go. And mind you, we're now almost 8 or 9 months past that point of the quitiversary, right? And I'm each week I'm sitting with these guys and we're talking, and some of it was like, oh, I said, "So how can I help you guys? Like, what's painful?" Like, well, let's pretend we're a doctor and a patient. Like, what hurts? And one guy says, "Maybe you can just tell me what to do when something happens." And I said, okay. And this guy was he was just a workhorse. He was a beast. Watch him walk into the kitchen, you can just tell him that he's ready to get down and dirty and in it. And I'm listening to him talk, and honestly, he wasn't managing. He was just working as hard as he possibly could and hoping that everybody else was going to follow suit. But for whatever reason, they weren't. They seemed to have lost a little bit of desire to follow him, maybe. And the other guy was super driven, like crazy driven, just like, I want to get these people in order, I want to get everything going. And what was odd was the guy who wasn't so driven and who was just working hard, he was the chef. And the sous chef was a little bit more methodical and had been in bigger restaurants and bigger companies. And so I think he understood a little bit more about what it takes to lead. Had seen better leaders, I think, in his time. Um, and again, it started to coagulate or congeal or set up in my mind. I was like, this is what is necessary. Chefs need a little bit more leadership, and I had seen that in the last 10 years. That the chefs I've been working with, their leadership skills weren't great. Honestly, when I started as a sous chef, my leadership skills were nothing. I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. And it took me a long time, and I think that I was lucky and that I worked for some good leaders and I asked a lot of questions, and then I did my own research and I asked them more questions about kind of what leadership looked like and felt like. And, I read Leadership for Dummies because why not? And I think my wife helped me by finding other books on leadership. When I said I need to be a better leader, she said, okay, here, let's just do what you do. You figure it out and you read. And so my leadership developed, and I think that for a lot of people, they don't necessarily know the route to do that. Um, and these two gentlemen in front of me were definitely that case. And so rolling along, the first 4 unit company was doing well, and we were now moving into the spring. And they asked me to. They started pushing a little bit, like we want you to come and work for us full time. And I was like, nope, that's not gonna happen. I am not interested in just doing that. I want to continue to see what is going on. And I think it's really important to stop here, take a half a step to the side, and say, when I started working with that coach, one of the things that he asked me to do and asked me to try, and I was reticent, by the way, was to start writing on LinkedIn and start working on my profile and start building up sort of some authority and working along the lines of building my personal brand, creating some thought leadership, building my network, and just kind of adding more people to the people that I knew, so that I had more options and people to talk to as I kind of stumbled down this path. And so I started doing that, and that was going pretty good. I met some pretty interesting consultants, and even found some people that I really enjoyed talking to. Sometimes it was once a month, sometimes it was once a quarter. And so building on LinkedIn, I took that account from like 300, because I'd always used it as, like a lot of folks do, I always used it as a glorified resume. And so I didn't really know how to do it. So I did a lot of reading on that. Like, how do you do this? How do you make your profile better? How do you post on LinkedIn? What does that look like? And I eventually hooked up with a guy, and he kind of acted as my LinkedIn coach, but also another consultant. And his name is Jim Taylor. So shout out to Jim Taylor and Benchmark 60. Gosh, what did I not learn from that guy? But he helped me to understand a bit more about how a consultant can interact on the internet, and how that can be a virtual space. Zoom is the tool, and being able to talk to people and really get ideas remotely, and convey information remotely. And so all of that to say, I built that account from 300, and now I think 2 years later we're sitting somewhere around, I don't know, 4,300. Woohoo! And some days I post things, and I hear little teeny tiny crickets, and other days I get some pretty good feedback, get some comments and get some likes. I even get some reshares and reposts every once in a while. And so I had begun that process. I had begun to make the room a little bigger. And so as I was now step back to the right and say, this 4-unit company, they said, so we'd like you to come on full time. And I said, no. I'm really enjoying sort of being me and building me, building my own brand, and learning to do that, learning the hows and the whys and the whats of that. And so they kept pushing, they kept pushing. I finally said, well, they finally called me in and said, okay, what would it take for you to commit to a specific agreement with us? And I said, what does that mean? They said, well, what if we made it work for you and maybe it was part time? So I went on. We came up with something, and it was, I don't know, 25 hours a week. And interestingly, within about 6 weeks, I started to feel some of the stress that I had felt in my previous job, and I started to feel that thing that people talk about on Sunday afternoons or Sunday evenings of like almost the dread of Mondays. And it started to really just, it manifested itself in me not sleeping real well. It manifested in a little bit of anxiousness and a little bit of anxiety. My wife definitely noticed, and that was one of the main signs. Is she mentioned it, and I thought, this isn't, and then this isn't great. I'm not loving this. I stepped away from a job because it was giving me all of these feelings. This is a less pressured, but nevertheless still fairly pressure-filled environment. These people jam. I mean, there's no two ways about it, and they work hard and they expect a lot. And it felt like it wasn't the right thing. So I was okay, but I wasn't. And then I don't know. Then I think the bar got moved, right? Like it just, they changed some of their expectations of our original agreement, and I didn't like it. And so I said, you know what? I don't think that's a thing. And so here I am back now. I was doing a little bit of work for them and still working with the pizzeria, the second job that had the cafe and all that had gone away, and I found a couple more clients, and so that was cool. I now had a guy up in the Canadian Rockies, once again another chef who needed some leadership help. He, and this is a real interesting one because he said to me, he says, Simon, I want to work less. I worked way too much during last summer's busy season. I said, okay. He says, but I don't know how. What do you mean you don't know how to work less? He goes, if I'm not there, I don't feel good. I don't feel like I don't feel like everybody is in the right place at the right time, and I feel like I have to be there. And I said, well, and that was a big eye opener for me. And I thought, gosh, I know that feeling. And as I started to talk to some of my friends who are chefs and talk to some other chefs, just again, LinkedIn brings you more people to talk to. So I started to reach out to some of those people, and sure enough, it's a really, it's common. And so some of that is lack of but I'd been away from that level. I guess I learned how to do that stuff and didn't look back. And so I hadn't really thought about that in a little while. Hadn't thought about how hard it can be to get in a place where you're comfortable delegating. How hard it can be to manage your own time so that you actually have the ability to stop and look around and manage the systems that are in front of you, hopefully that you have in place, so that you can lead and manage your people. Because if you're not managing your time, you don't have time for anything. There's just no way. You end up chasing your tail. You end up putting out fires. All the urgent, not necessarily the important. And so we worked on that, and I worked on that guy's time management with him. And what came out of that is, as he was sort of taking inventory of all the things he did on a regular basis, he then took the initiative to copy and paste all of that information and then did a little bit of editing, and he came up with a checklist for his team. And so we were able to take that checklist for his team and create daily checklists, but also there was like a special one for when he wasn't in the building, so that if you needed to do his job and he wasn't there, these are all the steps he took in a day, and he literally mapped it out from 8 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock at night for some of those longer days for him. And then we were able to turn those into some station checklists. But it was amazing all the things that we got out of just taking an inventory about what somebody was doing. And so all of these things led me to the second quote that I had for you at the very beginning of all this. And that was, being a cook, or being a great cook, is not enough to be a great chef. And it's this concept that really drives Culinary Mechanic. It's this concept that I've tried to instill in my thought process for the podcast. But it's also as I'm talking to chefs and as I'm coaching chefs, and now I've had the opportunity to coach a few restaurant owners and company owners around all the systems that need to be in place so that there is good solid structure, so that the owner can walk away, go home, and have a life, and not necessarily just grind themselves into oblivion and get to a place where it isn't fun, right? And so, yeah, that's where we are. Here we are in October of 2022, and I realize that makes this podcast all of a sudden not evergreen because it's dated. But that's okay. I think that 2 years and a little bit of change into this experiment, into this journey, I have been able to affect some people's lives. I've been able to help some people understand what it takes to drive their business and run it like a well-oiled machine, and help some people figure out their life around their business or around their kitchen. It's become the time management and the task management and the delegation thing have become even more top of mind for me. So as I go forward, I'm looking at ways that I can teach that, ways that I can impart that information, because I think that as much as running a restaurant is all these the delicate balance of all these really important systems, I think until you as a leader are leading yourself really well, and understanding how you need to interface with your business and with your operations, until you're able to do that, leading people is almost impossible. I'm sure that some people would disagree with me, but I don't really care at this point. That's what I've found to be the case, and that's what I've been able to help people with, and so that's what I'm going to keep doing. And so here we are. And I just want to say that, I want to thank everybody that listens to this podcast, and I look forward to doing more of these solo episodes so that we can continue to talk about how we move forward with the restaurant industry, how we can create some culture around teaching, and not only teaching how, but teaching why, and how leaders, whether they be chefs or restaurant managers, or I think at some point just leaders in general, can interact with their team in a non-toxic manner so that people are excited about going to work because they're going to learn something, or they're going to be in a space or a place where they can learn more about what they're doing and they can grow. Because I think when that happens, you start to create a really solid culture piece that makes people want to be where they are. And I think that's really important. So thank you so much for playing with me today. And I will say that every week that I do this, there's just a few more people listening and a few more people watching. Genuinely appreciate all of that, and look forward to talking to you again.